So, like generally helpful to think about practicing in a way that is consistent with the fruits that we want out of meditation. So if we want to be more even keeled, to be a little calmer, to be more relaxed, that our approach to the practice of meditation should have those qualities. So relaxing the body is also really helpful. Relaxing the amount of effort. We're straining to keep the mind on the breath, and really what we're practicing is straining rather than practicing like a relaxed, easy way of being. There's something you can like check in periodically. Sometimes I like to have these sort of like if I'm working on some aspect of my practice, I'll use the time that the mind wanders as a cue to, so the breath's happening, and then thinking about what I have to do tomorrow. And the moment I realize that the mind is wandering, to maybe even drop in this question like, how am I practicing in a way that is uh, in alignment with what I'm seeking out of meditation? My efforting, my relaxed? Is there a sense of pleasantness or unpleasantness? We're just attuning more to orienting the mind in that direction. Of course, it's not always pleasant. We have discomfort in the body, or we might be agitated or have something on our mind. And then the practice becomes, can I even relate to that experience with that same attitude of welcoming, not resisting, allowing a kind of soft gentleness to uh, witness what needs to be witnessed and let it pass through some way. So let's practice together. There's a story from the time of Buddha. It's actually one of the suttas, one of the teachings. Um, it's called the Beauty Queen. And in this story, there's a beauty queen that shows up some village, town, and she's said to be like the best singer and the best dancer. So throngs of people collect to see this beauty queen. You know, I'm imagining it's like the Taylor Swift of that day. There's like people, there's like a frenzy around seeing the beauty queen. And then the Buddha's creating this scenario, and he says there's a man who has to carry a vat of oil on his head in the midst of this chaotic scene. And if he were to let even a drop of oil spill, there's a man standing behind him with a sword who will just finish him. Um, so that's the flip side of the kind of encouragement for practice I was giving you to like to relish in the pleasure or enjoyment of it. But there's the other side of it is, you know, the metaphor of what happens when we lose our mindfulness. Like what harm we can do in the world, what harm we can do to ourselves. That the like I've sat with the Zen teacher Norman Fisher many times, and sometimes he'll give the meditation instruction, meditate, meditate as if your life depended on it. And then because it does, in some sense it really does, like our practice. Um, and mindfulness is the center of it, because if we don't have awareness, if we're not aware, if we're not tracking what's going on around us or what's going on internally, then there's no place of agency. And we're just caught up in the streams of habit, energy, moving around the wheel of samsara endlessly. So tonight I wanted to talk about uh, mainly I wanted to talk about generosity, but the prelude to that is that in Buddhist practice we have like different approaches or different practices. One is the practice of mindfulness. And my favorite way to talk about mindfulness is, or the mindfulness practice, the meditative practice or vipassana practice, is that we develop the wisdom to know where to rest the attention, where to rest the mind, you could say where to rest the heart. Uh, and this alone is extremely challenging. And we live in a particularly challenging time. There's so many things vying for our attention. And what do we give? What's most helpful to give that limited resource of attention to? And it requires sort of constant discernment. Where's good use of my attention in this moment? So through our meditation practice, we develop this wisdom, this discernment, in this moment, using the intention in this way is helpful. And that might be, you know, to use a random example, full engagement with all the things that are happening in the world, to open the compassionate heart to a time of, from any upheaval and difficulty. Um, or it might be to seclude the mind, as we've done in these moments, to have just like a modicum of stillness. Um, to developing the wisdom to know where to rest the heart, and then actually have the meditative skill to do that. That's one thing to say, I'm going to seclude the mind. I'm gonna attend to something and attend to someone, but it's not so easy because the mind has a mind of its own, especially if we're in a time where there's some problem we're trying to solve or some anxiety or difficulty, then the mind just keeps gravitating to that. It becomes very difficult to concentrate. So part of what we're developing in our meditation is this stewardship to know, to actually be able to rest the mind somewhere. Every time we sit down and meditate, we're building that capacity to have more and more agency over the mind. You could say that's one aspect of the practice. The other aspect of the practice is developing the qualities of heart that support that endeavor. And there's a list of qualities that I don't think the Buddha ever put this list together, but later people who were kind of commenting on and cataloging the Buddhist teachers came up with this list of 10 things that we call the paramis or the perfections, these qualities like spiritual strengths or virtues that are very beneficial, considered essential to awakening. And the list starts with dana, generosity. Everything starts with generosity. Um, the others are sila, integrity, morality, nikama, renunciation, simplification, letting go of that which doesn't serve us, panya, wisdom, virya, energy, kanti, patience, sucha, truthfulness, aditana, like resolve. We make a vow or commitment, and then metta, like friendliness, loving kindness, and the last one is upekkha, equanimity. And when I first came to practice, I think I had this view that these qualities just were sort of innate and they came, people, different people had different measures of them. This person's really patient, this person's really kind, this person has a lot of resolve. Um, but Buddhist practice holds that we can actually cultivate these qualities, actually build these strengths. We can actually, like, in a way, kind of change our character by developing these virtues. They're kind of, these spiritual strengths or these virtues are so helpful to meet life's difficulties. Even worthwhile, you could look this up, 10 paramis on the internet, and even to like memorize the list. And then in a moment of difficulty, you can ask yourself, what would serve me right now? You know, is this something that requires loving kindness, something that requires patience? Do I need like some energy, resolve? These are the things that kind of help us navigate the ups and downs of life. And in the stories of the Buddha, the legends of the Buddha, I'll say, um, there's a whole text called the Jataka tales. That's all the sort of past lives of the Buddha, and uh, he's people of different station. Sometimes he's a king, sometimes he's a pauper, sometimes different animals, and it's kind of I guess, the Aesop's fables of Buddhism that in each story there's some spiritual quality that got cultivated, and over eons, um, so many of these spiritual strengths were cultivated that he was then born in this uh, form that had all the right conditions for awakening. And whether or not you believe in rebirth, I find it kind of uh, inspiring that it's kind of like the long game. You know, we can be patient in uh, the sense that it takes time to cultivate these qualities of heart, but that if we practice, they inevitably emerge. I find it, kind of interesting the time scales that they talk about in the Buddhist texts, like eon or kalpa, I think they call it. And the kalpa is if you have a 4 mile by 4 mile by 4 mile cube, it's like a giant rock mountain that's 4 miles by 4 miles by 4 miles, and every 100 years, an eagle flies with a piece of silk in its mouth and just brushes the top of the mountain. That an eon is the amount of time that it would take for that mountain to completely erode. Just mind-boggling amount of time. Probably more time than we think the universe has been in existence. So when the Buddha started teaching, he came up with this approach to teaching, which was he called the graduated path. And sometimes he'd skip ahead if he discerned that somebody had like more spiritual maturity or more development. But generally, the teachings always started with generosity. And there's accounts of people wanting to hear more esoterics or deeper teachings, emptiness and karma and other kinds of things. But the Buddha always started with generosity. There's a story of a little girl on a school bus that she comes to the front of the bus and she offers the bus driver a handful of peanuts. And he's like, "Oh, thank you, dear." He enjoys the peanuts, and A few minutes later, she comes up with another handful of peanuts. And he's like, oh, thank you. A few minutes later, she comes up with the third handful of peanuts, and the driver says, oh, no, thank you. Um, but why don't you enjoy them and share them with your friends? And she said, well, we just like sucking the chocolate off of them. So this is not generosity. There's a quote from a Tibetan Lama. When you're practicing generosity, you should feel a little pinch when you give something away. A pinch is your stinginess protesting. If you give away your old worn out coat that you wouldn't be caught dead in, it's not generosity. There's no pinch. You're not doing anything to overcome your stinginess. You're just cleaning out your closet and calling it something else. Giving away your coat might keep someone warm, but does not address the problem we face as spiritual practitioners to free ourselves from self-cherishing and self-grasping. It's a Tibetan way of talking about like being overly self-centered or self-preoccupied or selfish. And every time we come to a gathering like this, we are sitting in the stream of 2,500 years of uninterrupted generosity. That these teachings came to us through um, for hundreds of years. It was people dedicating themselves to memorizing the teachings, chanting the teachings every day till they were like fully learned and memorized, and uh, sharing them with people. Uh, Almost always on the generosity economy. The tradition has been that people would renounce the material world to dedicate themselves to the teachings and to steward the teachings. And by and large, that's how they made them to us. Um, we even tried to mirror that ethos in InsightLA. So many things like these groups are just offered. There's not a price to come here. It's just offered on the spirit of generosity. And there's so much generosity in that, the generosity of attention, the generosity of care, the generosity of apprentices learning from masters. I think about all the generosity I've been shown by my teachers with their kindness and their guidance and their attention, and never really asking or expecting anything in return. This place, it's like modest place as places go, but like it costs a lot of money to have this space. There's rent and there's utilities and there's insurance and there's like many, many other things I'm probably not even thinking of. And it all happens because people in the community have been generous. But one of the reasons the Buddha started with the teaching of generosity is that it's like pretty straightforward, easy way to generate happiness. Like when we're truly practicing generosity, it's not obligatory, and something in our heart is moving us to support something we care, it just naturally brings happiness. And there's actually a lot of research these days about different scenarios where they give people different amounts of money and they can either spend it on themselves or they can spend it on others. And invariably, when they spend it on others, their level of happiness and well-being increases. And this has been replicated across cultures and across the world. There's a study I was reading about the other day that uh, people were invited to either make a donation or to volunteer 30 minutes of their time. And interestingly, people got more satisfaction out of donating their time than they did donating their money. So when we think of generosity, sometimes we just think of money, but it's so like the generosity of our attention, the generosity of sharing the skills that we have in the world, also bring satisfaction and well-being. There's one study that showed that people who have a pattern of generosity have greater lifespan, a greater health span, which on one level is surprising, but on another level isn't surprising because like when we do think there's probably some stress relief in the happiness that comes from being generous. I've been doing a practice. I'm sure I've talked about it before, and it really is a practice. It's surprisingly hard to do for something so simple, but that practice is that when I'm in a conversation with someone, when someone is whether it's in person or whether it's on Zoom, on the phone, whatever mode of conversation, I try to um, literally and figuratively put down whatever I'm doing and fully attend to that person. Um, and I find it quite challenging, especially on Zoom. Like there's the hands just find the keyboard and other things are happening. Uh, but when you do that, especially in person, I just feel like people notice it and it's unusual, you know. I was having a conversation with someone recently and I was actually doing that modicum of mine. Like they came into my space and I put down what I was doing and I attended to them. And at one point they were like, What? 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 You know, like it's just something that seems strange. And it was just that I was paying attention. Being generous is a uh, active, alive expression of loving kindness. So when we're generous, we're in a field, we're creating a field of metta. Again, a kind of antidote to being overly self-absorbed or kind of like in our own stew of whatever our problems are, um, and brings us into a relational field. You know, one of the pitfalls of a meditation, say, community that over prioritize sitting quietly with your eyes closed, or over prioritizes or like retreat practice where you spend days or weeks or months just sitting quietly with your eyes closed. Um, and no knock against that. You know, I've had tremendous, it's like the best thing I've ever done is long retreats, but we can get overly self-absorbed if we kind of take ourselves completely out of the relational field. So anytime there's generosity only happens in that relational field. And this field is so important, and we know that babies will die if they're not held. Like this, the number one indicator for lifespan is strong social relationships. Uh, so this is like vitally important to our health and well-being. There's a story about a barber who was known to be very generous, and he would often give away his services. So florist came in and got their hair done or cut or whatever, and then like came time to pay, the barber said, I can't take your money. I'm practicing generosity." And then the next day, he found on his doorstep a dozen roses, the florist. And then the next day, he had a baker come in. Again, wouldn't take the baker's money, and he got a dozen muffins as a return gift. And one day a politician came in and same thing. He said, "Can't take your money, practicing generosity." And then the next day there was a line of 12 politicians standing outside the door. You can interpret that how you how you might. the practice of generosity takes us out of the acquisitional paradigm of happiness, the paradigm that most of us get, particularly if you grew up in a Western culture, like your happiness and well-being will ripen when you get that degree or that job or that house, that relationship, whatever it is we're kind of seeking. We're conditioning our happiness on that. And we don't always get what we want. And when we get what we want, it's really like hard to maintain a perfect set of conditions. And ultimately, and perhaps more potently, like real generosity is mostly about letting go. That Gillick Rinpoche said it's an antidote to our stinginess. It's an antidote to whatever it is we're kind of hanging on to, feeling of um, scarcity. And this is intimately connected to Buddhist practice. Second noble truth, Buddha said that um, all of our reactivity, all of our suffering, all of our mental anguish comes from clinging and aversion. So anytime we're practicing strengthening this muscle of letting go, it's kind of like right in the heart of the path of practice. Ajahn Chah said, if you let go a little, you have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you'll have complete peace. I've had this experience as a child in India that there's like such a level of generosity that is sometimes inversely proportional to people's resources. Like the people who have the least have like the most generosity. And a story about this anthropologist who went to a really remote part of Appalachia, and he was interviewing this woman who lived in like a dirt floor shack with no plumbing, no electricity, very basic, kind of lived mostly off of a small garden and foraging and a bit of hunting. And he asked the woman, "What would you do if you came into a large sum of money?" She thought about it for a minute and she said, I guess I'd give it to the poor. And there's like that generosity sometimes, the spirit of generosity somewhat comes with a feeling of abundance or at least sufficiency. Like this woman who by our standard has almost nothing has it in her heart. Doesn't see herself as poor. The Buddha said, if people knew the results of giving in the way I know them, even if it were their last morsel, their last mouthful, they would not eat without having shared it, if there were someone to share with it. Well, one aspect of generosity I feel is like especially uh, timely is kind of magnanimity or graciousness, where we give people the benefit of the doubt. We assume good intentions, maybe even assume the best intentions of people we disagree with. And in the realm of practice, like maybe like being generous with ourselves in some way, like going easy on ourselves, not berating ourselves when we fall short or don't meet our expectations. And maybe there's also a kind of generosity in like pushing ourselves like a coach might when we need a little bit of encouragement. Famous study that was done at Princeton with the seminary students, two groups of seminary students. These are people who are training to be clergy, and one of them were asked, one group was asked, write a sermon on topic of your choice. And then the other group was asked to write a sermon on the Good Samaritan. Good Samaritan is a person who goes out of their way to help a stranger in need. And then they staged it so that on the way to give the sermon, uh, they had a shill, actor who was lying on the ground moaning in obvious distress. And the hypothesis was maybe that the people who were contemplating the Good Samaritan would be more likely to stop and help the stranger in need. And it turned out there was no difference in the two groups. What made the difference in whether the person stopped or not was how much time they think they had to get to the sermon. So if they thought they were going to be late, they actually wouldn't stop to help this person who's lying on the ground moaning. It's almost comical, but it's like so informative that our busyness, our sense of like we got to get there, um, is an obstacle to our generosity. The old guy dies and they ask, how much did he leave? And somebody says, all of it. I think whatever we have in this life, we don't get to take any of it with us. Someone was admiring the comedian Billy Crystal's watch, and he said, it used to be my grandfather's. He was not a generous man, but when I was at his deathbed, he wanted me to have it, so he sold it to me. It's such a funny idea that somebody's about to die and they still want to get their little piece of the action. I think it was a joke. Yeah. Mm. I mean, he's a comedian, so probably. Maybe I'll end with this quote from Ajahn Chah. And I've been listening to people transcribed and translated a lot of his talks. I've been kind of listening to them on some of them are on YouTube, some of them are in audiobooks. Um, but I find his teaching to be very like to the point. He says the heart of the path is so simple, no need for long explanations. Give up clinging to love and hate. Just rest with things as they are. This is all I do in my own practice. Don't try to become anything. Do not make yourself into anything. Don't be a meditator. Don't become enlightened. When you sit, let it be. When you walk, let it be. Grasp at nothing, resist nothing. Of course, there are dozens of meditation techniques to develop samadhi and many kinds of vipassana, but it all comes back to this. Just let it all be. Step over here where it's cool out of the battle. Oh, anybody have any thoughts on generosity? Questions, comments, reflections? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gulu. for putting so much time and thought into that. That was really wonderful. I was really moved by the generosity of giving something away that you're not attached to, and feeling that pinch.
Mm,
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. What is that then, if
yeah.
you're donating or if you're giving something away that you don't want? If that's not called generosity, what is that?
Yeah.
I really appreciated that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it could be a form of generosity, like you give stuff to the Salvation Army instead of throwing it away. There's some element of generosity in. But I think the point that Gillick Rinpoche was trying to make is that uh, true generosity is letting go of something that is in some way valuable to us. Like um, we're practicing generosity to develop the skill of letting go. When we look at other aspects of the path, like what are we letting go of? We're letting go of all our attachments. We're letting go of our attachment to views. We're letting go of our attachment to sensual pleasures. Um, and those are hard things to let go of. Yeah. So uh, starting with stuff, it's like just training that capacity to let go. I mean, I think any kind of giving is probably on net good for society. Like people give because they want, their name on a plaque. You could say, is that true generosity? Because it's like there's a lot of self in there, a lot of ego in there. Yeah. 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 Let's get you a mic so that people online can hear.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and the sit, and it's really lovely. I was just going to say, because my first 9 years of formal training were in Tibetan Buddhism,
Mhm.
and I think that maybe the subtlety that we're just pointing to is that in Tibetan Buddhism, we'd use opposing force meditation, which is what you were referring to. So it's like the generosity in that psychology, right? It's talking about when we use it as an opposing force meditation. So without the pinch, without the resistance, then it can't be opposing force to stinginess, right?
Yeah.
But there is also a different so if we're not using it as opposing force, generosity can also be giving what that person needs despite you wanting it or liking it, right? So it's just,
Yeah.
that's the subtlety. It's a science of mind, right? So it's just about what is this cultivating. So when we're generous with something that we don't have an attachment to, right? What it actually is cultivating is interbeing.
Mm.
It's sympathetic joy, right? Or loving kindness, the well-wishing for another, is unconditional friendliness, right? So that kind of that's what that cultivates, right? And it's so interesting. Like, I really appreciate in the talk that you mentioned how the skillful application of Buddhist psychology is about knowing what practices cultivate what qualities,
Yeah.
and that what's appropriate for you in this moment, right? And even where you place your mind. And I really appreciated that, like externally or internally, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that came to mind when you were talking about how sometimes you cautioned around long retreat becoming self-absorbed, and what I wanted to kind of debate back is that what I notice in long retreat is actually when you're actually practicing skillfully and you're going through the jhanas, that automatically what it does is it dissolves sense of self.
Yeah.
And so there's that interbeing feeling, right? And one of the most joyous moments I remember on like one of my long retreats was, breathing with the salamander at Spirit Rock, and it's just this like beautiful sense of like, of the self being lifted. And then it's like, nope, that problem's not there anymore, right? But I also am hearing you, and I think it's important to point to, that's the self-absorption is it can be like a little landmine, right?
Yeah.
When we start becoming so absorbed in our own inner world, and the complexities and dramas of it. So I really appreciated that subtle pointing. So thank you.
Yeah.
Beautiful talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You know, one thing that you said that I really um, amplify is that, you know, any practice that we're doing, paying attention to what we're cultivating with that practice, you know, which, you know, our intention, certainly a big part of that. Yeah.
I think the hardest thing is to give without needing to give, you know, and how solid a base the giving comes from.
Hmm.
And how perfect can you get at that? Something was said by one of your colleagues back, well, even if you give because you need to give, it becomes a habit that serves itself.
Hmm.
You know, that you can grow into it.
Hmm.
But to be able to give entirely selflessly, not about the material need for it, but what it does for you, is very challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but you know, on the other hand, if we're talking about a path of practice that leads to well-being, that leads to happiness, that leads to contentment, then I don't think it really matters that there might be mixed motivations. Like we do give because, in part, because it makes us feel good. And so it's like a dual benefit that we get the joy or happiness of well-being, of being generous, and then the person gets hopefully something that they actually need that's beneficial to them.
Yeah, I say, yes, it should feel good to give. There's a satisfaction. The problem is that if you have to give, because if you don't give, you're going to feel really bad.
Yeah, right. Then it becomes obligatory. Yeah.
Giving is an addiction.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, we can get, you know, overly attached to even things that have a wholesome quality. And then it's just like another addiction to relinquish. Anybody online would like to join the conversation, you're welcome. Anybody else?
Are you there? I mean, hi. Okay, so, well, here's a little story to tell. Abby's a musician, and she had a gig a few weeks ago, and her parents came to the gig, right? And they wanted to leave early, and one of our mutual friends came up to me and said, "Hey, I mean, sure, her gig was done, but they didn't want to like hang out longer." One of our mutual friends came up and said, "Hey, you know, I don't want to like throw her parents in an Uber. Do you mind taking them home?" And the thing is that I didn't. I mean, I already saw your gig, so I didn't want to stay any longer either. I wanted to leave too, and so I was like, "Oh, this is perfect because they're on my way home." And I said, "Yeah, actually, I will." And our mutual friend kept on saying over and over again, "Oh my God, you are so generous. This is, you know, so great that you're doing this. I really appreciate it. I don't want to put our parents in an Uber. We're in Hollywood, you know." But for me, I was like, well, I want to go home anyway. So I didn't feel like I was being generous. But from her perspective, I was being really generous. It just made me think, oh, it has to do with, well, then was I or was I not, you know?
Yeah. Take the credit.
I mean, yeah, but it was, I mean, it helped. It was kind of more an excuse for me to get to go home too.
There's me trying to ship my parents off in an Uber. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you know, that like that is an interesting case, and you could contemplate, you know, what's true generosity, but the converse case is when somebody is like offering you things seems to happen to me a lot, that you don't really want. You know, like I always say, no presents for birthday, or, you know, as a Dharma teacher, like if I'm a spirit rock or something, people will come up and give me things. And well, I appreciate the heart that wants to give me the thing. In my mind, I'm going, oh God, like more stuff. Yeah. I don't know. During food, I know
It's such a cool story, but I'll really paraphrase and make it short. But just to your point about giving what you don't want or don't need, and Thich Nhat Hanh has, he emphasizes that it's not real love without understanding.
Mm.
So durian fruit's that fruit in Asia that tastes like garbage to some people and it tastes good to other people, right? And so he said he's one of the people that gets nauseous from the smell. So he said, if you love durian fruit, and you force me to eat it, you actually are causing me to suffer, even though your intentions are good. So it's so interesting as we break down this idea of generosity, the complexity of it is like, it's their deep understanding and that as to what is beneficial to the other person, right? Or in Tibetan Buddhism, Dalai Lama was giving a talk and he was talking about like, if you're generous and offer a drink to somebody who's an alcoholic because they say they're going through, the shakes or whatever, that's actually not generosity because we're causing harm, versus this kind of generosity is for ultimate well-being, right? So interesting. I love that you brought this topic up.
Yeah, durian fruit is yeah. I've had it, but actually my experience was that it smelled like death, but it actually tasted pretty good. Yeah, I mean, never again.